So I'm gonna end today with discussing landscape and the Renaissance in Northern Europe, especially in France and in England. So just real briefly, I'm going to talk about a few examples of landscape because this is important for planning purposes, and I want to give you some context as landscape design develops and changes over time. I want to show you the landscape of Villa Lante in Bagnia. This is from 1566. Giacomo Barozzi Vignola is the landscape designer here. And it's dramatically set, if you look at the section up here, it's dramatically set on a hillside. And so we get terrace levels for this garden design. The palace or villa is actually way up here on the far right, up here, you can see it. It's actually quite small compared to the landscape. And the things I want to point out is that in Renaissance landscape design, everything is on strong axes. So we have a central axis that runs straight through all the way from left to right. And then you have cross axes that go, perpendicular to those at various points. There may be times when you sort of are forced to move off the axis. So you see here, there's a big fountain right here at the center of this square. So you would have to go around here, but you always come back to that axis and then you go straight again. Sometimes you'll have to go upstairs to the sides, like you see right in this area. That gets you to the next terrace level. And again, around and so forth. That helps you move about and experience the space three-dimensionally, but everything always comes back to the axis, to the symmetry. That is the most important element and aspect to remember of Renaissance landscape design. So here's an aerial view. You're seeing that big square. Here's the fountain in the middle. There's a fountain, then there's these water pools that fill off the square. So you actually come through this gate and you can walk straight in and around the water feature and then keep on going, or you can meander around the gardens off to the side. But even look at each of these segments of the gardens are all the same, right? So that's, adds to the symmetry of the overall gardenscape. And then you notice that the axis is very clear going straight on through this element here, even when you occasionally have to go up stairs off to the side and so forth, you're brought back to that central axis. So here's a nice view of that lower garden with the fountain and the water feature here. And you'll see the classical Renaissance elements within anything built, the balustrades and so forth. Here's a view a little further up, the water feature that goes down the central axis into pools and reflecting ponds all the way down to a focal point. That's the entry gate off in the far distance there. Almost a little Roman arch, right? Or a Roman triumphal arch with a pediment on top and classical colonnades in this little archway. So everything has this vista and symmetry and axis to it. This is the view looking up the hill. And again, you can't necessarily look straight, that's kind of boring. So you're forced off to the side, walking up, but you come back to that central axis. That's the key here. And a lot of this is based on the excavations and documentation of Hadrian's villa. This is the Roman villa that the Emperor Hadrian built in the 2nd century CE outside of Tivoli, which is just outside of Rome. And so the ruins of that remained, and the Renaissance architects and designers were looking at this as their inspiration. And it was this vast, sprawling complex. One of the most significant elements is right here in this sort of graphic reconstruction of it. And you can see the same symmetry and axial planning that we see in Renaissance architecture. And the sort of main highlight is this reflecting pool here that was flanked by caryatids. Remember caryatids from Greek architecture. And at the far end was this half-domed sort of amphitheater almost. All of this was just as classical, right? You know, Roman, Greek architecture. Hadrian loved Greek architecture, so that explains a little bit the caryatids that he placed here. And even though it's in ruins, you know, the Renaissance architects were documenting this and understanding how the full layout of this was created and replicating that. And another element at Hadrian's Villa was this little island that he created inside a rotunda. So here we see this rotunda garden wall. There was a colonnade that went around the outside of the pool of water, and then a little island on the inside where he had like a little retreat. This was a place where even in his retreat of the villa, he had a more private retreat space on literally on an island to get away from his court, to get away from the pressures of being emperor and so forth. And so this is based on this, you know, colonnade element that is, you know, we've seen some examples of in the past, and we're going to see examples moving forward, both in Renaissance and in later generations. And the granddaddy of all landscape designs, Renaissance landscape designs, is the Villa d'Este, also in Tivoli, so it's just not too far, stone's throw away from Hadrian's Villa, from the 1560s and early 70s by Piero Ligorio. This is a very wealthy family. The palazzo is here in dark shadow on the left. This is also on a steep hillside. You can see in the section here. So there's a main garden space down here at the bottom. You can see the flat part down low in the section, and this wide, you know, the axes, the cross axes, the water feature at the center, and each of these little square garden plots, they're all the same. They create a symmetry to this overall cross-axial planning. And then, you know, a series of switchbacks of stairs and ramps that lead up to garden terrace levels that eventually lead all the way back up to the house. Here's a great plan that's quite old that shows you that pretty well. This is the lower garden area down here. And you can see how there's hills that slope up on two sides, including up to the palace building itself on the far end of that. And they put in, you know, here's a rounded curved feature over on the right that is similar to what that rounded feature we saw at Hadrian's Villa. So, and another one over here on sort of the upper left has a sort of rounded feature with a fancy garden water feature. So just a few views of that, and again, very dramatic with the terracing and the hillside that allows to create a garden that's then just flat in almost 2 dimensions, but is vertical in 3 dimensions, and taking full advantage of that. So here we see this is almost Baroque here, so this is a little added a little bit later, but this immense, really dramatic water feature built into the hillside is really a key element of this. And here we see some other water features and the dramatic vista off into the hillside valley below. Here's a view looking up towards the palace, so the steep hillside with the switchback stairs, but on axis, that's continued with, you know, this little colonnaded element with a water, you know, fountain in front of that. There's another arcaded element, and even the entry pavilion to the palace has an arcaded element. So we see that strong symmetry and the strong axial element here, repeated over and over. Here's some more of the water features in the gardens. There is here's another great water feature. There is a video, kind of a drone view of the gardens, which is fun to watch. We don't have time to do that, but on your own, if you want to click the link later, you can do so. All right, so let's talk about the Renaissance in France. So it comes a little later, and it really comes because of some French invasions. The French nobility, they invade these different elements, these different states and city-states and so forth in the late 15th century and early 16th century. And normally warfare is not too good for architecture, right? But what this does is when they pull back and they retreat back to France, they bring some of that knowledge with them. And they even literally bring people with them, like Leonardo da Vinci is hired by the French king to say, hey, I want you to come back, ostensibly to help him design implements of war, which he's famous for, but also, he's going to work on other stuff too. And so that doing things like that helps to spread the Renaissance philosophies and ideas throughout France as well. France also is consolidating, the French monarchy is consolidating its power around this time, and that helps provide political stability and also a source of wealth. The monarchy is quite wealthy and can be an influential patron to architecture and to the arts, and so we start to see the French monarchy hire and nobility hire Renaissance architects. And also, with the end of the 100 Years' War with England in 1453, that does provide also some stability and wealth, right? Because if you're paying for a war, you can't pay for grand palaces and so forth. So that also helps lead to the French Renaissance. And one of the earliest examples is at the Chateau. This is from 1515 to 1524. And this is a complex, this is a country state that the French kings had. This is outside of Paris, near the Loire Valley. And Francis I decides to put this addition on in 1515. And the elements we're really going to be talking about is this element up here at the top. So there's different wings that had been built and so forth, and Francis I is like, okay, I'm going to build a new wing, and this is one of the first times we're really going to see the Renaissance in France. And here is a view of it from the courtyard looking straight at that Renaissance wing up here in the center. And there are going to be some similarities to Italian Renaissance, but there's also going to be some modifications that are unique to France. We see, and let's zoom in a little bit here. I think it'll make it easier to see. So the similarities are, we see the tripartite divisions. We have 3 levels, and we have, in fact, a Doric order at the base, an entablature or belt course. We have a second level with the Ionic order, another belt course, and then a third level with a Corinthian order and a final kind of thin cornice on the top there. So just like we had seen in other Renaissance palazzos, tying back to the Colosseum, we see that tripartite and we see the 3 orders. But if you look on the top, this is something we haven't seen before, a big, tall slate roof. This is France. This is in Northern Europe. And what do they get in Northern Europe that they don't get in Italy very often? Snow. So if you have snow, you can't really do a flat roof or a very thin, shallow roof. That's too much load to support. And so the French in Northern Europe are tending to put steeper roofs that in this case is covered in slate. Slate's an easily accessible, cheap material for France. And so you see these gray slate roofs on their Renaissance palaces. We did see that in Italy because they don't have snow there. And we also don't see the really heavy cornice line, that projecting cornice line that we were seeing in Italian Renaissance palazzos. The other thing we're seeing is these big, tall windows. We're going to really start to call them French windows, right? They're casements, they swing out like doors, and they're taller than, a typical window, right? You think of a window has a raised sill and it only goes so high. This is, 15 feet tall in some cases, much taller than a human person. You throw open those on a nice day and you get in lots of fresh air and ventilation, which when people didn't bathe and you had chamber pots, that fresh ventilation was probably pretty important here. But we do see other elements. We see this Roman arched entryway here. That's pretty typical. We're seeing this curved design here that that is not unlike what Palladio would do later in the century. So we're already seeing some elements of pre-Palladian Palladio even. Another element here is really quite wonderful is the stairway This is off on the wing off to the side here, this helical stair or winding stair, but it's also based on Renaissance approaches with classical pilasters and entablatures and so forth. So other noble persons, not necessarily kings, but the other nobility also wanted to create, chateaus. The French call them chateaus in the countryside, just like the wealthy Italians created villas. We're going to see a booming of French chateaus, especially in the Loire Valley. And one of the most important is the Chteau de Chantilly. This is from 1519. Finished in 1547. The primary architect was Domenico da Cortona, but Leonardo da Vinci also helped design a grand stair within that. So here's two examples of the Italian influence, right, that helps to lead to the Renaissance in France. Domenico da Cortona is also an Italian architect. He is enticed to come with the French and promised, lots of commissions and prestige and wealth. And of course, Leonardo da Vinci was brought back by Francis I and was working for him, and he contributes to the staircase here. So here's a floor plan. Now, chateau literally translates out of French to English as castle. But this looks almost like a castle, right? It's got these outer walls, and then you've got the inner courtyard, and then the sort of square building in the center that in a castle would be known as the keep, right? The final, little compound where if they breach the outer walls, they might, you might still be able to defend the keep on the center here. But these are not medieval castles. When we talk about a chateau, a French chateau, we're really talking about a palace or a country estate. And the name doesn't really translate literally here, even though at Chteau de Chantilly, it actually sort of looks a little bit, at least in plan, like a castle. Here's the exterior. And here again, we see some radical breaks from Italian Renaissance architecture. We see each floor level is divided, and we see Roman arcades, Roman arched arcades. We see the horizontal belt courses and so forth. But once again, we see the tall slate roofs. Now, the French figure out pretty early on, if you got to have a tall roof, you can do something inside there, usually servants' quarters, but they need some windows, so they start to see dormer windows on here. Didn't see that in Italy. The corners have even taller, more dramatic roofscapes. The other thing we start to see is really dramatic chimneys and little towers and so forth that almost clutter up the tops here. This is something we never saw in Italian Renaissance designs. It's messy, it's cluttered, and the Italians just never, they wanted clean lines and almost simplifying their architecture. And so this is almost a leftover of French Gothic, where they're okay with having some of these vertical elements and stuff, and they decorate them with lots of ornamentation, but it's not something that we would have seen in classical Italian Renaissance. We see the French windows again, the really, really tall windows that are, really representative of French Renaissance architecture. This is the staircase that Leonardo da Vinci designed. It's a double helix stair. And what that means is that you see here in front, you see the sort of round stair going up and up and up. There's a second one on the back side. We're seeing the underside of the stair that's leading up back here. A little hard to understand if you don't see it, but this model here shows what I mean. There's actually two stairs that go up and spiral up past of each other. It's a really complicated design that today we could do in computer modeling very easily, but for someone to figure this out and how to build it that's essentially self-supporting. If we go back to the image of the stair, you'll notice, well, it's hard to tell, but there is not a center pier. If you think about a spiral stair, there's often like a solid center pier that the stair spirals around. Doesn't exist here. These are self-supporting with the piers off to the side that help provide some vertical support. And again, when we look at it in the model here, these clear plastic tubes represent the outside anchors, but the inside is open, fully open, and that's a ingenious structural development that Leonardo da Vinci creates as well. Another very famous French chateau is the Chteau de Chantilly. This is from 1515 to 1521 by Philibert de Lorme. So here we see a French architect. So some, early on we get, Italian architects and designers coming up, and they then provide inspiration to other French architects. And this is an early example of a French architect, Philibert de Lorme, creating his own version of a French Renaissance chateau. This one is very dramatic because it actually spans across a river. It's a bridge, right? It's a house on a bridge. How many times are you going to see that? You can see some of the Renaissance gardens actually off to the side here. The main house here on the left has a lot of similarities to the Chteau de Chambord, right? It has the sort of curved corners like a castle might. It has the tall slate roof with very clustered chimneys and dormers and so forth. But really, the bridge element that extends out over the river is the most graceful of the designs. And I have a better view of it here. And you can really compare on the left the more fussy, clustered design with the much more simplified Renaissance element of the bridge off to the right. We see even some of the Renaissance circular pediments over the windows. We've got dormer windows, but they're much simpler here, and we don't have the fussiness of all the chimneys and towers and spires that we see on the left. So again, there's the Renaissance inspiration and formatting, but with the adaptations of the French, including, at least still here, the tall slate roof and the dormer windows. An example in Paris, probably the most famous example in Paris, is the Place Royale, also known as the Place de Vosges. This is from 1605 to 1612. This was a royal place or plaza. The French call a plaza or piazza in Italy, in France is called a place. So this was created by the French royalty. They wanted to carve out a section in the medieval part of the Marais district, these narrow, twisting, winding streets, carved it out. Only the royalty, right, could, basically buy up the land, evict the people that living there, and say, we're going to tear all this down, and we're going to create this formal square in the center and surround it with fancy houses for the French nobility. This was kind of a way for the French king to endear himself with the nobility and concentrate his power, because it's like, hey, I'm going to build you a townhouse, and it's going to be really nice. It's going to be beautiful. It's not going to be in this messy, crowded medieval city. It's going to have this beautiful open plaza out front, out your front windows, and that helps to, engender, kindness or whatever, and gratefulness by some of the nobles who would buy townhomes here and live here. And you can see in this plan, the messy medieval streets that still exist in the Marais district. So here's an aerial view of the complex, and again, you get a really good view of how messy and crowded the neighborhood is all around it. And then, boom, in the center is this perfect square cross-axis, just like the Renaissance planning we had talked about just a few minutes ago, and surrounded by buildings with, identical facades. So this really creates, it's a work of urban planning as well as a work of architecture. And so here we see a great view sort of standing in the center of the place, looking at these French Renaissance facades here. So I'll show you this of it. You can see it better. we see some similarities to the French Renaissance. We have a ground level with Roman arcade loggia that not unlike Italian Renaissance. We have a couple of different levels, but actually no more do we see the heavy belt course between levels. It's really more of a vertical emphasis here than we have ever seen in Italy. You notice that it's brick with some stonework. Brick is a more common material, more available, and also cheaper. Even the French king sometimes has to watch the budget. So we start to see brick more often. Not a very heavy cornice line, and here's that tall slate roof with dormer windows stuck on top of that, and the practicality of needing a lot of chimneys in northern climate, so we see a lot more chimneys sticking up here. At the four axes, on axis or whatever, we see a sort of enlarged element that almost creates at the base a Roman triumphal arch. We have a large, wide opening with the archway pilasters with the smaller openings off to the side. Again, based on the Italian or the Roman triumphal arch, which was an influence to Italian Renaissance. So we see elements of Italian Renaissance here, but us radically breaking into new directions here with the French. And this is a view of the arcade. The loggia that goes around it was lined with shops. And so the nobility would rent or buy, the townhouses and live above, and the ground floor would have shops that, even in this era would have been high-end shops that appealed to the wealthy people living here. And even today, there's, it's an exclusive, high-end shopping district with wonderful cafes and restaurants and so forth. And you can sit in outdoor cafes under this loggia. I had a great dinner here last time I was in Paris with my wife. We sat under this loggia having a great dinner. I mean, it's the quintessential Paris that we think about. And it's really one of my favorite places in Paris, which is saying a lot because I love Paris. All right, so leaving Paris, we're really rapidly flying through here. And it's not to say that some of these things are not significant, but I got to get this covered before we run out of time. So let's talk about the Renaissance in England. So the French Renaissance happens, a century after the beginning of the Italian Renaissance. Well, the English Renaissance happens almost a century, or at least a half a century or so after the French Renaissance or whatever. And some of the things that help lead to the English Renaissance. Well, first, it starts late in part because we still see medieval and Gothic design well into the 16th century, well into the 1500s. Henry VIII, King Henry VIII, famous for all his wives and so forth, he, of course, famously breaks from the Catholic Church in 1534 so that he can divorce his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, and marry Anne Boleyn. And he couldn't get an annulment from the church, and so he says, well, fine, I'll start my own church. And that creates all kinds of problems, wars and conflicts that happen for centuries between Protestants and Catholics. But it also helps to sort of almost distance England from Renaissance philosophies and architecture because they do not want to associate themselves with anything they think is Catholic, right? And so there is a delay until the reign of Elizabeth I, Queen Elizabeth, starting in 1558. She's also a Protestant, right? But by the time you get to Elizabeth, she has really cemented her power and the power and philosophy of the Protestant Church in England. And so now there's a moment where you feel like, okay, we don't have to distance ourselves so dramatically from the Catholicism and the ideas of Renaissance. And so that was associated with Catholicism in England. So it is during the reign of Queen Elizabeth that we really start to see a blossoming of the Renaissance in England. And also it doesn't help that this political stability increases wealth, increases the power of the nobility, and we start to see a real rise in England after this period. And they really turn to Palladio for their inspiration, in part because they can get copies of his 4 books on architecture, and they look at this and they start to, if not directly copy it, they're at least inspired by it. So a very early example of what I'm talking about is Longleat House in Somerset. This starts in 1567, so you can see it's a late date, finished by 1579 by Robert Smythson. And we see a much more traditional Renaissance, Italian Renaissance palace here. We have the tripartite design again. We have the 3 orders, Doric, Ionic, Corinthian on each level. But we start to see a few differences. For example, there is a balustrade on the top instead of the heavy cornicing. We see all the sculptures on top like we saw with Palladio. And we actually are seeing more French style windows here. In a northern climate, just like the French had figured out, you need ventilation and you also need more light. So we see more of an outward facade than the Italian versions, which were more inward, right? Where the inner courtyard was the open space and the outer walls had either small windows or in some cases almost no windows. So like the French, the English are opening outward. And especially in these country houses where you have great vistas and views, you want to take advantage of that. So we see a mix between Italian and French in England. There's almost a combination of this. Skip ahead. This is a painting showing from 1619, so not too long after the house was done, showing the landscape that was completed by Capability Brown. I'll talk more about Brown here briefly, but again, we get almost a Palladian landscape where the garden walls come out and extend. We have an axial approach right up to the main entry of the house here. But it's a pretty accurate painting to the actual house that was built. The most famous and most important of the English Renaissance architects is Inigo Jones, who lived from 1573 to 1652. Not to be confused, don't get Inigo confused with indigo, the color, and don't get Inigo Jones confused with Indiana Jones and the movies from the 80s, which were some of my favorite movies growing up. He has a cool little hat on, but it's not the cool fedora that Indiana Jones, and I don't think he carried a whip. So he's an incredibly important house or architect, and one of his most important works is the Queen's House in Greenwich. This was started in 1616, and it's called the Queen's House because the King of England built it for the Queen. The story is that the king wasn't entirely faithful, and his wife found out and was rather upset about her husband's infidelities, and so as a kind of soothing gift to sort of soothe over her feelings, he built her a house out in the country in Greenwich. Greenwich is just outside of London. And apparently that did the trick, I guess. I'm sure he probably continued to be unfaithful. That's just what people did back then if you had power and wealth, I guess. But she got a house out of it. And it's actually a really cool house. And you see that this is really a Palladian style Renaissance design. It's not 3 stories, but we've got a rusticated base here on the ground floor, a smoother finish. We've got, entablatures over the windows. Here we have a balustrade on the top facade here. The arcade that extends out feels very Palladian as well. That kind of creates this wide open courtyard with the balustrade. We saw that at the Villa Tricino. Here's another view of that. This is also going to be quite an inspiration to later architects in the young United States when they are designing the President's House, and we'll talk more about that later. Here's a floor plan. Now, originally, this was actually built on a road, and right down the center is a street or road that they kept. And there's actually two wings of the house and a bridge that connected over top of the road here. So kind of an interesting planning standpoint. And it was a little country house, so there's not much to it. It was a little place where the queen could get away and have some parties and get together with her entourage and friends. From an urban planning standpoint, we'll talk about Covent Garden. This is in London from the 1630s. And this is very much the London version of Place de Vosges. Same thing. We had the medieval meandering streets of London, and what Jones is able to do is carve out a square within that and line the buildings or facades around the square with Renaissance, designs. In this case, he creates also a church at one end that is sort of a focal point. And then we see in this rendering here, we see the facades just like Place de Vosges. There's an arcade loggia on the ground floor and then a couple of levels up above. Here is a couple of rendering views, beautifully done. So this is the church. Notice it is a Roman temple front, just like Palladio would have done really at the Villa Barbaro. The Roman temple front, a wall that extends out, and two wings off to the side. So he would have seen the designs for Villa Barbaro and said, hey, I could do this, but make it a church instead. And then the facades of the rest of the square are very much based on the Place de Vosges that we just talked about. We see the rusticated base with the Roman arched arcade, and then in this case there's pilasters that connect the second and third stories, but there's more verticality than we would have seen in Italian Renaissance architecture, just like at Place de Vosges. So he's painting showing the church and some of the facades. Not all of the square was completed, so you see still some other buildings that are intermixed in here. Unlike, I guess, the power of the French nobility, they couldn't quite have the wealth or influence to finish off Covent Garden here, but the design scheme is definitely there. Here is the church as it appears, in contemporary times. Again, very simple Doric order Roman temple front. There's another view of that from the edge. And you can see a little bit of the Inigo Jones's building pavilion off to the side, just like we saw at Place de Vosges. The upper floor is of brick. Again, it's a cheap, easy material to get a hold of in England and France. And I know we're going a little over time. I'm going to keep going so we finish this. If you have to go, you can watch the end of the session and the recording. But I want to talk about the Banqueting House. This is in London in the Whitehall neighborhood from 1619 to 1622, also by Jones. This was part of a royal complex. This is long before Buckingham Palace became kind of the royal palace. Whitehall was the primary royal palace of London in this time. And the Banqueting House was basically a party room. A room where you could have the king, or in this case the queen, could have royal banquets and so forth. And we see a really traditional Renaissance palace facade on the outside. We do have the heavy belt course here dividing the first and second level, but again we have a balustrade on top instead of a deep cornice. We have larger, not quite French style windows, but much larger windows like we see in the French tradition, but more typical triangular and circular pediments on the lower windows, and on the second floor windows we see more just straight on entablatures over that. Here is a elevation view of that. And again, we don't have the Doric order here. We start with the Ionic order, and then on the second level is the Corinthian order. So they playing a little bit with things, but still having the two different orders on two different sides. Here's a nice detail that shows the first level with the Ionic order and the triangular and the circular pediments over the windows. This is the actual interior, the Banquet Hall. It's famous also because the ceiling was painted by Peter Paul Rubens, with very important artist from this time. But we see also kind of a neoclassical, right, with the Ionic and the Corinthian orders on the two levels, and a little balcony with a balustrade along there as well. So this was part of a grander palace that Jones was going to create. This is a scheme layout that he had developed to create this big grand palace. But the problem was King Charles I, who had commissioned this, wound up creating enough conflict in the nobility that he lost his head in 1649. This is a cool rendering. He's showing the execution. Here he is being kneeled down and getting his head chopped off. But they actually show a representation of the banqueting house. It's not an accurate representation. This is not meant to be an architectural rendering. It's really to show the execution. But you know, they show kind of an Ionic classical pilaster, and they do show little pediments over the windows and the balustrade here. So I think it's kind of a cool rendition of that. I mentioned Lancelot Capability Brown. If you're going to give yourself a nickname as a designer, Capability is going to inspire your clients to feel confidence in your abilities, I suppose. So kind of a cool name, I think. And he was really known especially for his landscapes. So these are similar Renaissance-inspired landscapes like we saw earlier just a few minutes ago with the Italian Renaissance. Here he has a greenhouse or an orangerie where you could, it's basically a greenhouse and you could grow tropical fruits like orange trees in here year-round in a colder climate like England, but you see a large layer of windows, but it's basically a Renaissance design. And then we have a symmetry and axis for the garden design itself. He also did architecture, and a famous design is Croom Court from 1754. So we're pushing, you know, like I say, almost 100 years behind into the 1700s here. And this is a view of that, very much a Palladian villa here. We have a Roman temple front as the entrance, just like we saw, say, at Villa Rotunda. And we have, you know, Renaissance design. Look, a Palladian window over here on the left and the right. Very strong symmetry, very strong central axis here. All elements that we saw in late Italian Renaissance and especially with Palladio. Very, very much inspired by Palladian design here. And lastly, a little what we call folly, just a little tiny building in a grand estate, where as you're walking around the gardens, you can, you know, sneak into this little building if it starts to rain, or if you're with your mistress and you want to have a little, you know, rendezvous or something like that. You know, you get away from the main house and prying eyes, and you can have a little encounter here. And so he creates a little rotunda. This is not quite, you know, a copy of the Tempietto San Pietro Montorio by Bramante, but it is a perfect little circle with entablatures over the windows and a spherical Pantheon-inspired dome. The only thing we're missing from the Tempietto is the colonnade that would go around it. So again, very much inspired by classical Italian Renaissance architecture. All right, so that was a kind of a whirlwind at the end. Thanks for hanging on there, but that finishes the Renaissance.